Boeing 787 Dreamliner nose landing gear suddenly collapsed.
Boeing 787 Dreamliner essentially collapsing
was gear off a parked Boeing 787 Dreamliner.
Nose landing gear collapse.
June 4th, 2026. A brand new Lufthansa Boeing 787, delivered just 4 months ago, collapsed onto its nose. Collapse. That's the term most media outlets used. But the engineering data tells a completely different story. Landing gears are designed for the absolute worst case scenario of hard landings. So when the aircraft was just parked at the Frankfurt Airport, it saw one of the lowest stress state the structure can ever see. So collapsing in a state like this is highly unlikely. To understand this geometrically, let's take an example. Let's assume the aircraft tire punctures and completely deflates to the rim, and at the same time the volumetric shock absorber bottoms out and collapses completely. Even in these two cases combined, the aircraft still maintains a positive clearance from the ground. Now, let's take a look at this viral clip. As you can see, the nose gear don't just snap, buckle or break due to its own weight. The tire simply moves forward, away from the pavement and towards the aircraft. Now, let's take a look at the normal retraction of a 787. As you can see, the nose gear retracts forward. Combining with the fact that the nose gear door opened fractions of a second before the collapse, we can definitely say this is not a structural collapse. It's a fully powered hydraulic retraction. Retraction of a 787 landing gear is not just a single actuator pulling the landing gear up. It's a multi-staged hydraulic sequence. Let me elaborate. Stage 1. The crew selects gear up. Stage 2. The main and the nose landing gear door actuators open. Stage 3. A dedicatedly operated hydraulic retraction actuator fires up. Stage 4. The retraction actuator retracts the nose and the main landing gear together. Stage 5. The landing gear reaches the retracted position and an uplock engages, ensuring that the landing gear never extends unless an extension command is given. 5 steps, each one entirely dependent on the last. Now obviously, these things shouldn't happen on the ground. So Boeing installed highly safety redundant systems into it. Let's elaborate this one by one. The primary electronic safety layer, the weight on wheels sensor, also called WOW. Before I explain what is WOW sensor, let me first elaborate landing gear shock absorber physics. When the aircraft is at ground, it's in static condition. So during that time, the self-weight of the aircraft is acted upon the landing gear. Because of this, the shock absorber compresses. When the 787 goes airborne, there is no weight acting on the landing gear. Because of this, the shock absorber fully extends to its natural stroke. If you have understood this, now the weight on wheel sensor is placed in such a position that when the shock absorber gets compressed, a physical switch on the weight on wheel sensors get pressed and it shows the aircraft is on ground. Similarly, when the aircraft goes airborne, the shock absorber extends. Because of this, the switch releases and the WOW sensor shows the aircraft is on air. Since the WOW clearly distinguishes when the aircraft is on air and when the aircraft is on ground, Boeing logic is such that whenever the WOW sensor shows the aircraft is grounded, the retraction is impossible. Even if someone tries to manually give the retraction command, the WOW sensor blocks it. But unfortunately, there are some cases where WOW sensor gives some amount of error. First, when the aircraft is about to take off, there is a huge amount of lift acting on the airframe. Because of this, the airframe slightly lifts up, which forces the shock absorber to extend. As this extension happens, the WOW sensor loses its contact. Because of this, even though the tire is still grounded, the WOW sensor shows the aircraft is on air. The second condition is during landing. When the aircraft lands in very low all-up weight because most of its fuel got empty and it also lands in a very low sink speed. Since our landing gears are just passive shock absorbers, at the time of landing, there will be some amount of lift which already exists in the aircraft. And this lift will force the airframe to lift and the shock absorber stroke will still be in extended condition. Because of this, for few minutes, the wow sensor still shows the aircraft is on air when the aircraft is completely landed on the ground. Though these things are very interesting case studies, none of these things actually occurred for the Boeing 787. Why? Because the Lufthansa Airlines was just parked in the Frankfurt Airport for about 4 to 5 hours after landing. So by this time, all of these shock absorber error should have been rectified. So the one thing I can say for certain, for some reason, all 3 wow sensors malfunctioned or someone bypassed it manually. Beyond electronic safety layer, the safety of the entire system depends on few mechanical locks. Now, these terms sound very similar but operate very differently. The first is the down lock, the second is the down lock pin, also known as ground lock. The down lock is directly built into the aircraft structure between the upper and the lower drag base. When the landing gear gets fully extended, there is an inbuilt mechanism called the over-center mechanism. This over-center mechanism acts as a self-lock of the aircraft, and this self-lock can handle all types of ground loads which the landing gear can ever go through. This down lock will ensure that no ground loads can cause any type of retraction. But this over-center mechanism can be easily overpowered by the hydraulic retraction actuator, as even in air, this hydraulic retraction actuator first breaks this over-center mechanism down lock and only then the retraction happens. So to make sure unwanted retraction never happens in the ground, there is a physical steel pin inserted externally between the upper and the lower drag base, and this steel pin is called the ground lock. The aircraft can never retract as long as the pin is inserted. Even if the retraction actuator gives its full potential of 3000 psi and tries to retract the aircraft, the ground pin ensures that the drag brace won't fold, therefore preventing the retraction as long as the pin is physically inserted into this. This is the ultimate safety layer of the landing gear, preventing all retraction even though the wow sensor logic is somehow bypassed. However, Boeing 787 nose gear linkage has a very crucial geometrical trap. Two nearly identical pinholes placed very close to each other, one for the apex bore and the other for the ground lock pin. This apex bore is actually a structural pivot joint which helps in the revolving during retraction and extension. It also supports during some of the shimmy loads, but it doesn't exactly prevent any retraction or extension. The problem is, in both the apex and the ground lock bore, the steel pin fits and clicks perfectly, giving very similar feel, making it impossible to distinguish between these two. To understand how these system vulnerabilities lead to catastrophic incidents, let's take a look at a similar incident that happened on June 18, 2021. A British Airways flight, G-ZBZF, was being loaded with cargo at Terminal 5 when maintenance crew noted a fault message. The nose gear door solenoid malfunctioned. To troubleshoot this, the engineers had to refer a critical document, the Boeing Dispatch Deviation Guide, also called as the DDG. As per DDG, the aircraft is allowed to fly with certain faults, but it enforces physical landing gear door open and close cycles on the ground just to ensure the landing gear doors function properly. Now, the wow sensors were manually overridden to cycle the landing gear doors on the ground. So the entire safety of the aircraft relied simply on the ground lock pin. But here, the maintenance engineers fell into the geometric trap. They mistakenly inserted the ground lock pin into the apex bore. When the hydraulic test was activated, the nose gear just retracted as the pin was in the wrong hole, because of which the co-pilot and the cargo loader were injured. Hundreds of passengers on the stand watched this happen. Now, you may ask why the DDG only relied on the ground lock pin. Since a retraction command is being given, why not just jack up the entire aircraft and then give the retraction command? Well, jacking up a wide-body 787 is not so easy. A Boeing 787 weighs about 250 tons. This requires a dedicated hangar and a specific ground support equipment just to jack up this aircraft. Because this was meant to be a landing gear door operation jet, there was no requirement for jacking up from the DDG. UK's Air Investigation Board AAIB investigated this thoroughly, so now we have the full picture here. The AAIB's conclusion was very clear. This was a design level failure, not a maintenance one. What makes the British Airways incident tragic is that Boeing was aware of this design flaw back in 2018 itself. Two separate nose gear retraction issues happened in Boeing's own production facility. The cause was identical. Ground pin was inserted into the apex bore. So Boeing raised an internal service related problem on March 2019, requiring a permanent sleeve to be installed into the apex bore. This sleeve will physically reduce the diameter of the apex bore, making it impossible for the ground lock pin to be inserted into the apex bore. A year later, on 16th January 2020, Federal Aviation Administration FAA stepped in, issuing an Airworthiness Directive, making the sleeve modification mandatory for all the Boeing 787 operating worldwide. However, regulatory law allowed operators a multi-year window. The deadline was for 36 months. That was on January 16, 2023. So operators had the time to do the modification by 16th January 2023. So as you can see, the British Airways was operating completely unprotected till June 2021 when the fatal nose gear accident happened. History repeated here because the mandatory modification deadline had not yet arrived. This brings us directly to the current day Frankfurt mystery. If wow sensors provided primary protection and 2023 regulatory deadlines passed years ago, how and why did the nose gear retract? Well, certain sources say on June 3rd, a technical service order was lodged for flight DABBQ. The main landing gear door solenoid malfunctioned. Yes, you heard me right. The problem was with main landing gear door. Just like the British Airways, the fault was considered as accepted deferred defect. So as per the same DDG, a ground test was required to check the functioning of the landing gear doors. Since the retraction command was common for all the landing gears, the main landing gear stayed safe because the ground pin did its job correctly here, as there is no apex bore to confuse them. But the nose landing gear unfortunately retracted, leading to this fateful incident. If this test did happen, the electronic layer will definitely be bypassed, so the mechanical ground lock pin is in the top of the suspect list. Germany's BFU has opened up a formal investigation and we are expecting a preliminary report on July 2026. But the deeper question, the one the investigation really needs to answer. A brand new 787, which was just delivered this January 2026, had just 137 flights. 3 years after FAA modification and a post-2020 production from Boeing production facility. A post-2020 aircraft should have sleeves mandatorily installed at the Boeing's production facility itself, way before the first flight. In my opinion, here are some answers the BFU may find. The sleeves were not installed by Boeing in the first place. The sleeves may have been present but had somehow got compromised or destroyed during the maintenance. This has no chance, but there is a probability that this is a completely different failure mode by itself. Meaning the pin was being in the wrong hole is completely irrelevant, and this is a whole new issue. Each of these three answers pinpoint to a different failure in the aviation system, and each one has massive consequence on the 787 fleet. That's all for today, guys. If you like this technical breakdown, please leave a like to help the YouTube algorithm. Also, comment your thoughts on what you think the BFU investigation will uncover. Let me know in the comments if there's any other aviation or technical concepts you want me to break down. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.